Good evening, everyone. My name is Felicia Salinas Moniz, and I am the director of the Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender at Brown University. I am pleased to welcome you to the annual Masha Dexter Lecture on Gender, Sexuality, and Public Policy. The purpose of this endowed lectureship is to memorialize and promote in other students Masha Dexter's extraordinary energy and engagement with the overlapping issues of gender, sexuality, and public policy, as reflected in the broad range of her own activities. She was active in planning the LGBTQ Center. She was also active in the Queer Alliance, the Sarah Doyle Center, Students for Choice, and the American Civil Liberties Union. Masha was a writing fellow, a teaching assistant in economics, and a Meikle-John advisor. An economics concentrator, she was also a talented writer, an outspoken feminist, an engaged activist, a spirited debater, and an ardent friend. Her commitment to the principles of equality and justice in society were equal to her commitment and love for friends from all places and of all ages. For this year's lecture, we are honored to have Dr. Emily Knox as our featured speaker, who will present on the topic Intellectual Freedom and Social Justice, Understanding the Discourse of Censorship. Emily is an associate professor in the School of Information Sciences at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Her research interests include information access, intellectual freedom and censorship, information ethics, information policy, and the intersection of print culture and reading practices. Emily's next book, Foundations of Intellectual Freedom, will be released in fall 2022. She also serves on the board of the National Coalition Against Censorship. We are also fortunate to have Dr. Ken B. Phillips, the Director of Library Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Brown, who will moderate tonight's Q&A. Ken B. is an historian who works to highlight and center traditionally marginalized voices in libraries, archives, and museums. Currently, she is leading library staff in an exploration and education around racial justice in the Brown University Library. This event is co-sponsored by the Brown University Library, the LGBTQ Center, the Sarah Doyle Center for Women and Gender, and the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy. Audience members may submit questions using the Q&A function, and please note that this event is also being remote captioned. And now please join me in welcoming Dr. Emily Knox.
Hello, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. So I'd like to begin with the land acknowledgement for here in Central Illinois. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. In order to remind ourselves and our community, we will begin this event with the following statement. So we sit on the lands of the Peoria, the Kaskaskia, the Pianakasha, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It's necessary for us here to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Over the next 150 years, we will be a vibrant community inclusive of all of our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. So along with other initiatives that we are doing to support Indigenous people in this area, we also offer a Peoria Tribe Scholarship, and this scholarship is available to members of the Peoria Tribe of Indians of Oklahoma, who are connected historically with the state of Illinois, and also a Tribal Nations Scholarship that's available to undergraduate and graduate level students who are not a resident of the state of Illinois and are a member of any of the tribally nations federally recognized by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I hope that we will do more in the future. So today I'm going to be talking about information access, when I think about the work that I do in general, this is the overall idea. How do we make sure that people have access to information? Now, I work at what is formerly called the Graduate School of Library and Information Science. We have a Library and Information Science program that's been around for 125 or more years. And this is really what libraries do. They provide access to information. Now, people really focus on the books, and I have books here, but in fact, libraries provide access to all different types of information. For example, during the pandemic, often libraries would keep their own Wi-Fi on so that even though people couldn't come into the public library, they would sit outside in the parking lot and use the library's Wi-Fi there. So today I'm going to be talking about a very particular part of thinking about information access, and that's intellectual freedom and censorship. So these are some definitions from this new edition of the Intellectual Freedom Manual. The term freedom of expression, so this encompasses the freedoms of speech, press, religion, assembly, and association, and its corollary right to receive information without interference. Often people don't use this term. Most of the time you hear when people are talking about these issues, they use the term free speech, and I can talk about that a little bit more. So intellectual freedom, which is a very, I would say, library-centric term. You see it every so often in the general public, but it's a very important principle within librarianship. This is the right of every individual to both seek and receive information from all points of view without restriction. Finally, censorship. This is the suppression of ideas and information that certain persons, individuals, groups, or government officials find objectionable or dangerous. So what has been a lot of discussion prior to the last few months is really what is the intersection of intellectual freedom and social justice? So one thing I really try to think about, I love giving definitions, and a lot of times when people talk about social justice, there's no really definition of it. It's just sort of a concept, an idea that's out there. So in my work, I try to think about what do we mean by social justice? I'm still exploring this, but a good place to start is Justice is Fairness with John Rawls. So Rawls defines justice as the proper balance between two competing claims, and he has two principles that he gives in Justice is Fairness: the equality of assignment of rights and duties, and the idea that inequalities must be compensated. I also believe that in order to have justice, you must begin with acknowledging that there is a solution, a problem. If you don't acknowledge that there's a problem, you can never look for solutions. Let me talk a little bit about this poster that's right here. This is one of my favorite National Book Week posters. It's available just talking about book power. And you'll see as I go through this talk that in fact I will be talking about the power that books have over people. So related to these ideas, I also look at information policy. So I don't do what is called, what you might think of as big P policy. So these would be things like FERPA, HIPAA, these formal laws and rules that are enacted by elected officials. I don't really focus on that. What I really do is what I call practical policy. So these are really organizational guidelines, internal agencies, decisions, memoranda, social norms, guiding behavior. And what I'm particularly interested in is how policy affects information access. So what sort of policies can we develop to make sure that people are able to access the information that is important for whatever they might want it for. So it's a need, it's a want, it's for entertainment, anything of that sort. This is one of my very favorite books about practical policy. So it hasn't been updated since 2003, but I rarely write anything without referring to this book about policy. It was published by the American Library Association and the Public Library Association, and it's really a guide for thinking about how do we write good policy. It is very difficult to do, but Nelson and Garcia offer a lot of good guidelines for doing so. So what is the point of policy? First, a policy transforms an institution's values into action. So I mentioned at the beginning that a library exists really to provide access to information for people. So how do you do that? You need to make sure that your policy includes these values. It shows people how you will make sure that they understand the values of your institution. It also gives information needed to perform tasks. So one of the things that we talk about is collection development. So how do you decide what goes on a particular shelf or what you're going to put in a curriculum? That's really through a development policy. It also, they also make sure all members of the public know what they can expect from the library and that they are treated equitably. So one of the things I tell my students is that you need to make your policies public. So they need to be posted on the website, they need to be reviewed regularly, they need to be put, you should actually print them out so that people can look at them if they're not able to go and use a computer easily. Finally, policies provide support if there is legal action. Now, one thing that's happening right now with all of the different book challenges that we see is that we know that people are not following policy. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have policy. It means that you still need the policy, and this is what you can rely on if, for example, you want to bring legal action against someone who is not following a policy. These are the 4 parts of policy. So they talk about guidelines, statements, regulations, and procedures. And guidelines is really what I will focus on here. So these are not developed by the library institution, but they're statements from a larger organization, in this case, the American Library Association, for providing best practices for providing access to materials. Libraries, for example, are encouraged to use the Library Bill of Rights, the Freedom to Read statement, and the Freedom to View statement. Just very quickly, similar to mission statements, policy statements describe why a particular service is being offered. Regulations are what most people think of when you use the term policy, so that's how a particular policy will be carried out. And we often drop the procedures part because procedures are very time-consuming to write, but those are step-by-step overviews of how to do a particular task. So why does that matter? It matters because you need to make sure that there is redundancy, that anybody is able to say, okay, this is how I collect for collection development in this particular institution. And knowing exactly the procedures to do that is actually a part of the policy itself. So there's some other guidelines for intellectual freedom. I often talk about Article 19 of the Declaration of Human Rights. Here we can see Eleanor Roosevelt, who was actually the delegate from the United States for developing the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So this is from 1948. So it states, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference, and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media regardless of frontiers. I'm actually working on this a little bit, and one of the interesting things that came up while they were developing this particular article was that, in fact, the Soviet Union argued for information to be available but not accessible. Now you can see that those are quite different policy goals, right? The idea that, well, this information exists, but it's not necessarily something that somebody can get to. And this actually went back and forth among a lot of the different member nations that were discussing this. They finally decided that no, it's not just availability that matters, it's the actual accessibility, which you see here is the verb to receive. Here in the United States, we have the American Library Association's Code of Ethics. So these are the two codes that I'm actually talking about today. So the first one is the second article, which is we uphold the principles of intellectual freedom and resist all efforts to censor library resources. Article number 9, which is right below it, was actually just added recently in 2021. And this I would call a social justice article. We affirm the inherent dignity and rights of every person. We work to recognize and dismantle systemic and individual biases, to confront inequity and oppression, to enhance diversity and inclusion, and to advance racial and social justice in our libraries, communities, professions, and associations through awareness, advocacy, education, collaborations, services, and allocation of resources and spaces. So both of these work together within librarianship, and I hope to talk a little bit about how I think about this in my research. Just very briefly, if anybody is interested, these are actually the recommended policies for intellectual freedom in a library. So this is from the most recent edition of the Intellectual Freedom Manual. They say that you should have a collection development and resource reconsideration policy. I'll talk a little bit about that in a second. The use of meeting rooms and exhibit spaces, internet use, privacy and confidentiality, user behavior and library use, and also please have a social media policy. So what do these policies guard against? One thing that is happening a lot right now is that the list for American Library Association, their list for the most banned books of 2021 just came out this week. And a lot of people, if you look at the comments under there, they say, those books weren't banned. They were just challenged. They just decided to remove them from this one classroom. You can still get them on Amazon. So this argument, which I'll get back to again, is part of the discourse of censorship. But what I actually say, instead of saying that something is banned, I often say it's challenged. And what I say people engage in are censorship practices. So very few people like to be called censors. Instead, what I say is that I think about censorship as a constellation of practices. And these can be active. So the active practices are redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal. So those are the 4 R's, I call them. Redaction, very quickly, is when you mark through something. Restriction is when you put something behind a desk. You say, okay, you can read this, but only if you have a permission slip, or only if you get permission from a particular person of authority to be able to use this particular material. Relocation is a little bit difficult to talk about, but what it actually refers to is relocating an item from its actual intended audience to an unintended audience. The way this shows up, for example, in a library is that people will say, that book is not actually a young adult book. That book belongs in the adult section. So this is a relocation. What it means is that the people for whom that book was intended, so young adults, teenagers, would have to go to a different place to see that book because someone has said that's not the appropriate place for it. Removal is what most people think of when they think of censorship practices. So this is when something is removed. But it's very important to look at the level of analysis. Is it removed from the curriculum? Is it moved from the school library collection? Is it moved from a reading list? Is it removed from the public library? Is it removed from the internet, right? These are different ways of thinking about this final R of removal. So once again, those 4 R's are redaction, restriction, relocation, and removal. There are also passive practices. So this is something like self-censorship, deciding not to put something out into the world, a creative endeavor, because you're worried about what people will say about it. Bias, on the other hand, is when you decide not to purchase something. I'm worried that my principal will remove that, so I'm not even going to engage. What I specifically look at is something I call the discourse of censorship. Let me talk about this picture a little bit. So I'm sure many of you heard about Mouse being removed from the Michigan County schools. This is actually the board meeting after Mouse was removed. You can see the huge number of people here. We call these book hearings. This is when people show up for public comment at an open meeting and talk about why they support or do not support whatever the actions of the board were. I've been to some of these hearings. They're always very exciting. People are extremely passionate about books. So when I say the discourse of censorship, what I mean is the language that is used to justify censorship practices. I look at relationships among power, identity, and the nature of knowledge. I'm interested in libraries, how they operate in communities, how people understand the practices and policies of these institutions, and also reading practices. What does it mean to read something? How do we understand the act of reading? These are the primary theories I use in my work. So I am a social constructionist. I believe that language and symbolic power can impact the distribution of particular types of knowledge. I also use Bourdieu in my work because I'm interested in how people pull on ideas that are out there, so thinking about structuralism or objectivism, and what is inside of themselves, subjectivism or phenomenology, and how they operate within these boundaries. And this is what Bourdieu calls a practice. I also think of it as a poetic, a way of pulling on discourses that are out there to create this discourse of censorship. So it's not just that people are saying something that's, they aren't just saying like, for example, that there's an idea that certain types of works will be, they often talk about things like innocence, right? So they pull on a discourse of innocence and then they use it for themselves to say, and this is how this work will affect somebody. So I'm particularly interested in symbolic capital. So we hear a lot of people saying like, I'm a taxpayer. So they're also using their symbolic power this way. I'm a taxpayer. I get to say what you do in your classroom or in your library. Bourdieu also has this idea of symbolic violence, which is really about classification. So I talked about the idea of categorization. So the idea that this book is a YA book and not an adult book. And what Bourdieu talks about is who has the right to put things in certain categories. And he calls this type of power that people exert over this symbolic violence. I'm also quite interested in reading practices. This is the idea of really thinking about what are the models that we use to understand our current reading practices. Very quickly, I look at things like silent reading, which was not always true. People used to read to each other out loud, and this allowed for outside interpretation of a work. Also, I talk about the power of the word. So this came in really in the Reformation. If we think about sola scriptura, the idea that reading could actually save your soul. Now, of course, the reformers were quite worried about that, and they, in fact, put more interpretations. So if you look at Bibles from that time, you actually see that there are interpretations in the margins around the text. I also talk about things from the more modern era. This is the idea that that people have critical distance from a text, and often we, during the Discourse of Censorship, we hear about people who do not have critical distance from a text. And then finally, I talk about what I call monosomy, or common sense interpretations of text. At its basic point, the discourse of censorship is really about the idea that texts mean what they say and say what they mean, and there's only one possibility of interpretation. I also use Stanley Fish. So thinking about this interpretation, I really think about interpretive communities and strategies that certain interpretive communities that use. So this is the idea that people's experiences give the text structure, that there's no meaning that's embedded in the text itself, and that the interpretation itself creates meaning in a text. I do my research by doing Freedom of Information Act requests, and I ask for all of the reconsideration materials. So I said before that you should have a policy for reconsideration in a library. When a book goes through this, I also ask for these from schools and libraries and ask them to send me all of their materials. This is actually, I also attend book hearings, and I take our observer notes there, and also transcripts, and then finally I do interviews with people who challenge books. These are just examples of some of the things that I receive. So actually, this is the Moms for Liberty. This goes into how they understand books that particularly dealing with Ruby Bridges. This is when they were challenging the Wit and Wisdom curriculum in Tennessee, and they were very upset about Ruby Bridges and how she discussed her own experiences with desegregating schools. This other one that's on this side is actually from Katy ISD in Texas, and actually they've been on the news recently. You can see that they actually have a censorship practice here of redacting the text, but they basically are saying why they are upset about The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. They use a common discourse of saying that the film will be rated R, therefore the book is rated R, and also they say here at the very bottom, we see no literary value to this book. Very quickly, this is how I do my analysis. I do basic discourse analysis. So here you can see people talk about things like the effects of knowledge, what happens when you read. I mentioned silent reading or reading aloud. So what people often talk about is, are you going to be embarrassed if you read this aloud? And if you are, then that book is not one that should be given to children. It's inappropriate for them. Here's a more recent work that I've done. So looking at diverse books, and I'll talk a little bit about how diverse books, that's really books by anybody who is in an underrepresented population, especially with racial and ethnic minorities. What you often see is really Chimamanda Adichie's argument about there being one story. So any story is compatible with another story. So you'll see here this person says, you can get a comparable learning experience if you read something other than The Bluest Eye. Also, I have here about the restriction with the permission form. Finally, I really look at people's worldviews. I talk about childhood innocence, how people construct the innocence of childhood. Also, a lot about morality and values and the effects that reading will have on the character of a person. So a basic theme is really that society is a fragile backbone for life. Challengers from any side of the political spectrum, they actually talk about a sense of moral drift within society. They often use language of spiritual warfare. They talk about parenting a lot and how other parents fall on the job and how public institutions need to help them. Childhood is constructed in two different ways, either as a tabula rasa or if people already have bad things within them and they get triggered. When I talk about institutional practices, Public institutions are really seen as symbols of the community, and they should therefore have the values of the community. The practices and policies of these institutions are very opaque. People do not really understand how those books get on the shelf, how teachers decide which books will be included in the curriculum. That is really unknown. They only see the final product, that this book showed up, that the teacher is talking about what they might call critical race theory, that kind of thing. Finally, this is one of my very favorite pictures because I think it really shows the reading process, right? The idea that words and text jump out at you, right? This is about the interpretive strategies that people have. So I mentioned the idea that texts are monosemic. They can only be interpreted in one way. There's a fear of the indisciplined imagination, that people lack critical distance from the text, so they can't interpret text in ways that are not harmful. They talk a lot about imaginative visualization and mimetic behavior. So people will do what they read about. So if you read about people taking drugs, you'll want to take drugs. Also, it really goes to this idea of character and morality. The idea if you read something, it will become part of who you are, and that is who you will be going forward. And this is actually about short and long-term effects of that. So these are books that have recently appeared on the challenged book list. So what are these themes? What I really see is that book challenges are the movement of a private act into the public sphere. For challengers, the social sphere is actually a symbolic representation of the community, values, and beliefs. And the discourse of censorship itself can be understood as a discourse of both anxiety and of action. So how do we think about this really with social justice? What I gave this gloss, and this was during the 2016 election, I talked about how intellectual freedom is a liberal value where social justice is a progressive value. But one thing to know is that, in fact, if you're a political scientist, both liberalism and progressive are on the same side of the coin when it comes to thinking about political theory. So how do we integrate the two of these? I decided to look a little bit into thinking about liberalism, and it's helped me understand what is happening now. So intellectual freedom is very focused on this idea of individual progress. This, of course, comes from Mill, thinking about how does the individual think about truth. But when we talk about progressivism, we're really talking about these four number 4 and 5. So the idea of social space and group identity, and that is what comes to the fore also when we look at people talking about, for example, diverse books. They're very focused on this idea of group identity. If you think about Chimamanda Adichie's argument, it really is about how, well, of course, there's only one argument, only one story that can be told because people are not seen as individuals when they are part of an underrepresented group. Frieden, this is from the very short Oxford books. He uses these pieces of paper and talks about how tyranny is the bottom paper, and then the other 5 papers are stacked on top, and at various times, different papers shine through, so there are actually holes in these papers that you can see. So I actually think that we need to go back to this full spectrum of liberal values, so not just thinking about people in terms of being individuals. In fact, people occupy all sorts of social spaces, and they are also their individuals themselves. You can see how this goes back to Bourdieu's own ideas about practice and what I call a poetic. But how do we do this? Actually, Kimberly Crenshaw's ideas about intersectionality. So this is the idea that you are, and I'm using it kind of as a gloss or a heuristic, but it's really saying that people can be understood not just as one identity, but many different identities that work in social space. And also we can think about the individual themselves. The way I usually show this is by showing this picture. So all of these women share a particular identity. We can assume that they are all Black women, but that is not their only identity. They have other intersectional identities. And when it comes to diverse books in particular, when I look at people saying, this is all the same book, what I realize is they are flattening people down to one identity and not looking at each person individually and the story that they want to share with other people. So this is my very favorite poster for Banned Books Week, and it's the idea that words have power. And I think it really summarizes my research. The discourse of censorship is really about how reading is fundamental and that words have power. And that's really why people attempt to ban books. So thank you very much for listening to my talk, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Knox. That was absolutely amazing. I'm here just like feverishly writing notes about all the things you said, and I want to invite our listeners to add their questions and comments into the chat, and I will catch them as you add them. And while we wait on individuals to add their questions, I have so many questions. I almost am trying to figure out where to start. But I want to start somewhere kind of hopefully kind of simple. And one of the things that in many of the things that you were talking about, you're talking about the different ways, and read some of your work and some of the things and words and why people, what reasons folks give for challenging or wanting to censor or ban books. And I'm curious about if there's a difference, and what is the difference in challenging a youth book or a book intended for a youth audience or a children's audience or an adult audience, or what are the differences in the reasonings behind those different titles or genres?
So that is a great question, and let me answer it a couple different ways. So actually, no, there aren't a lot of differences in how people talk about challenging books on any level. But the actual interesting thing are which books are challenged. And this goes to this idea of critical distance and who has critical distance from the text. And actually, it is considered to be men who have critical distance from a text. Women and children do not have critical distance from a text. How do we know that? Because books that are generally intended for men rarely get challenged. So there are tons of violent books in libraries. There's horror, thriller. You never, ever, ever see those books on lists. On the other hand, many libraries chose not to purchase 50 Shades of Grey, even though this is an adult book, but because it was erotica. And what does that say about what happens when women read? So really, it's the absence of those challenges to male audience books that really tells you how people think about reading in the first place. So books for children, because children are considered to not be rational people, but also books for women often are not collected because of this idea that especially they'll lead to sexual arousal. But in fact, what about the violent books? What about the thrillers? Those do not show up at all, because the idea is that, well, mostly men read those and they'll never engage in the way that kids and women do, right? They are able to not just put themselves in the text. Now, that's not necessarily true, but that is the argument.
Wow, that's something I guess I never thought about when you said. I'm like, oh yes, yeah, right. Of course, men's books that are geared for men aren't challenged, and of course, it's a terrible thing to say, but it just hit me like that. And what one thing that you just said a few moments ago was that lots of libraries just chose not to purchase 50 Shades of Grey, and we can all understand or assume or whatever why. But one of the things that you said while you were talking was the difference. We were talking about the difference between passive and active censorship practices, and you talked about bias. And I was curious about, in terms of like passive, active, or if they're redaction, restriction, relocation, or removal, like which is most pervasive, and like where do these things show up in, or which would you assume, or do you know happens more often, that things are just not purchased or things are just removed, or is that mostly for children, or
Yeah, so actually it's almost impossible to know, but I'll talk a little bit about what we do know. So the American Library Association estimates that only about 10% of the actual challenges to books are ever reported specifically to them. There's some other organizations to do that, but they are the main organization. And we in the intellectual freedom community actually suspect that people don't purchase these books. So I've talked to librarians, for example, in the Deep South, who do not celebrate or observe Banned Books Week because it is so controversial for them to do that. Also, people worry about losing their jobs. And I'm particularly concerned about this right now with all of the challenges that are going on, that in fact, these books are just not being added to public institutions. It's difficult to prove that. Also, often people don't report when a book disappears. That's the other thing that happens. I particularly worry about this in schools, which is because the principal might go in and just move the book. And we do know that happens, but it's never reported. So that's what I was talking about, policies that you're actually supposed to go through a reconsideration process. So we don't have great data. We have a lot of anecdotes about this. But libraries and schools are actually very conservative. I don't mean conservative in like a political way. I mean, they don't like bad press. So they tend to do things that will keep them out of the news. And if it will keep me out of the news to not have this book on my shelf, I'm not going to have the book. That actually does not work very well, I'll just say, because people can find all sorts of books that they're upset about, or movies, or video games. So my favorite one for this is that a library in Alabama had a book on Leonard Skinner. Someone was upset about it, and they filled out the form, and you could tell the librarians were like, we collect everything on Leonard Skinner. Like, they did not like how the ban was portrayed in that particular book, and they wanted the library to remove it. You can't censor-proof your library because people interpret text in many different ways.
Wow, thank you. I have one more question, but I'm going to start reading the questions from the audience because there's some great questions. So we have our first one here. I'm just going to read. You mentioned, or maybe quoted, that the interpretation of a book can add meaning to the book. Do you find that it is perhaps of the strongest reasons why books get banned in more conservative spaces? Maybe I should read that.
Yeah, so the way I think it's easier to talk about it is that we all bring our own baggage to a text. So the text does not actually have meaning encoded in it. I mean, this is an argument that's been going on in literary theory for a long time, but it's the easiest way to understand censorship and why people can read things so differently. So we all bring our own selves to that text and then we interpret it. And so you might find that a particular text is harmful or upsetting. The way I like to talk about this is actually with reading or watching horror, reading horror books, watching horror movies. A lot of people get a lot of pleasure out of doing that. I cannot take it. I cannot sleep. And so you can see that there's a stark difference in the interpretation there and also how it affects me as a person. And so if you think about texts as just, not necessarily, I don't think it's right to say just blank slates, but really they're much more subject to who we are as people. So when it comes to positive, conservative versus not conservative, liberal spaces, in fact, there are books that are challenged in liberal spaces. These are often, for example, Huckleberry Finn is one, Monster. What you actually find about those is that they are challenged in spaces where there are very few Black kids. So my child is the only Black kid in this class. I don't want them to read this and have to have a spotlight on their Blackness while they are reading this. Or they're challenged for authorship. So the Lil Bill books were on the most challenged list because they were written by Bill Cosby. And so people felt they should be removed. So that's a different type that's about the author, but you can see that it's really all of these other issues and not so much the book itself that comes into people banning books.
Yes, I think when I first heard you speak about like not focusing on the content, but the reasons, I was like, make it make sense. It makes perfect sense.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that.
I have a couple more questions, and I'm just again going to read. Thanks for the great talk, Dr. Knox. My question is about creating public-facing policies around collections as a way to put our values into practice. Could you elaborate a little about how having explicit policies can serve to counteract censorship practices? This person works in an academic library, but sees parallels across the types of libraries.
Yeah, so start with the guidelines. So start with have your committee read through those guidelines that I gave. And then also look at other people's policies and say, does this policy make sense for my institution? Look at the mission statement of your own institution. That's actually the first thing that you do, because that will change how you think about what your policy should be. So it's actually a very careful process. You shouldn't take it on alone. There should be a committee, although Nelson Garcia talked about how only one person writes policy and other people just comment on it. But it's very important to just go through these steps. So you have to actually talk about your values. You have to talk about, what are we trying to do here? How do we make sure that comes forth in our policies? This is why a lot of people don't like writing policy, because it's actually very difficult. You sometimes unearth problems in your institution that you weren't as aware of before while you were writing those policies. So, review your policies on a regular basis, but that's really how you do it. It's through the communication. And then you send them up the chain, right? So then eventually the board, whatever the board is, so in an academic library, this might not go all the way up, but it should go up to like the executive committee or something like that. We'll talk about them also. And then they give this stamp of approval and say, yes, these are the values we want to communicate out to the people who use our services.
Right. Is there any one place where you've seen their policy done really well? Like, I know it's not a fair question, but is there?
So we actually avoid, because there are so many things that go into it. The main thing is to make sure you know your state laws. So look for a policy that you like that is related to, that's in your state and is your same type of institution. So I actually like the policies of my local library. So here at University of Illinois, we have really nice policies. Champaign Public Library has a really nice policy, but those aren't necessarily the same policies you would use in Rhode Island. So really look carefully, and the Library Association should be able to help with this. And this is also true for schools, for anybody who's in a school district to look around and see there. Also, policies should be vetted by legal counsel. So what comes up sometimes when people are talking about policies is they realize they don't have access to legal counsel. And you should not be an institution that deals with the public, whatever that public might be, with people, and not have access to legal counsel. So this is one of the things that all of a sudden people are like, well, how do we do this? Especially if you're in some way rural. Can your municipality give you access to legal counsel? Where's legal counsel for the academic library? Somewhere on the university level, right? Like, you just really have to think that through, but it's important because then you know if something happens, you know where you can call. And that's actually part of doing the policy process.
Thank you for that note, for awareness about where you are and for lack of a better term, limitations and availability for what we can do. Our next question, I'm going to edit just a little bit. Questioner would love to know more about your experiences at hearings, and that was on my list. And one of the most interesting experiences you've had at a hearing. Can you tell us about that? Yeah, let's stop there.
Yeah, so actually the best hearing I went to is in the book, Book Banning in 21st Century America. It was in New Jersey. People were upset about the absolute trade of part-time ending, which people are always upset about. I went to this hearing. It was packed. That's the thing about the hearings, is that there are just tons and tons of people. Also, it's exciting because people are excited about public policy, right? Like, all of a sudden they're like, I'm getting involved with my government. So this guy that I sat behind, he had read the whole book and he had flagged every page that he didn't like. He couldn't sit down, so he kept jumping up because we had to go through a whole technology presentation before public comment. And he would say he was like so upset about the book. And it was just wonderful. I mean, I was so excited to be in this room. But the actual most exciting part is to hear the kids talk about the books. How much the books mean to them, how they think about them, how they change their lives. That is the best part. Also, you hear a little bit about how teachers think about their work, how librarians think about their work, why they chose certain books, why this is meaningful. So the one I went to in North Carolina, they were talking about Invisible Man and why it was important for their AP students to read this book. And I love books, so it was great to hear people talk about this. So also in the time we are now, if there is a hearing near you, just go. If you have kids, take your kids. You get to see government in action. You get to provide support for the people who really need support at that time.
Nice. That's a great action item for us tonight, to find some hearings around here so we can see government in action and see what's happening. I have a couple more questions and we have a little bit of time, but there was a question here. Have you come across any instances where people of color, LGBTQ folks, and women have come together to challenge books that don't align with social justice values?
Yes, actually, there's the TERF book. I can never remember the title of it. So before all the challenges have been starting now, the big discussion in library world was, should a library collect this TERF book? Now, the way I always think about it, and a lot of people were like, absolutely not, the book is harmful. And you can see that these are the same arguments, right? It's the idea that everybody who reads that book will have this interpretation, will say, like, this book is correct. You don't actually know why someone is reading a book, that they will agree with it, that they won't agree with it. I've heard about this book so much, I would like to read it. I have no plans to give that woman any of my money, so I would like if my public library had it so that I can read it and see what her arguments are so I can fight against them. So yes, this happens quite a bit, but it's important to know that the arguments are the same. They are still about the monasemic interpretation, that this book is harmful. You cannot, it's a very paternalistic argument also. It's an idea that you know what will be the outcome of something. And that's often very difficult to do. So yes, this happens quite a bit, especially with these kind of books.
I don't know if you're able to pull up the Q&A because we have 3 really great questions.
Okay.
And I want you to be able to choose which one, because we only have time, I think, for one more question. And these are really great questions. If we haven't had the opportunity while you read, Dr. Knox, so just if we haven't had the opportunity to address your questions, it's not because they're not good. We're just running out of time. This is such a great evening and a great talk.
So I think I can do the one on the critical race theory. I'll do that one since that's very timely. So the important thing is, like, what I see people getting into are legalistic arguments about, is this critical race theory? Is this not critical race theory? And that's not really important. What is important is that our society is changing. And actually, all of these questions are about that. So what we are trying to do is say, what do we want the world to look like going forward? We are going to live in a majority minority country. 2 states are already majority minority. And what we see now is actually there are people who thought we had a shared idea of our history, but in fact, that history left out many people. And so deciding how we talk about our society is going to be extremely difficult. I keep saying 1619 Project book just came out. Don't know what's going to happen with that. It's been banned in a bunch of states. Also, how are we going to discuss the January 6th insurrection? I don't know, but I don't know if I actually want to be a 7th grade teacher teaching social studies and talking about that in some places, right? These are going to be very hard. Actually, there will be more lost causism when it comes to it, right? We must be prepared. So someone asked about what arguments. You need to talk about arguments about what world do we want to see going forward? How do we want to prepare ourselves, our children, for this new world? And it's very difficult, and there will be people who disagree with that. I think that's the hardest thing, is like, you won't convince everybody, but we live in a world of ubiquitous information. Kids need media literacy. They need to understand the world as it actually is, and how you can move to a more just society. And people have different ideas of what a more just society is. So these are very hard, but they come from a particular place, which is that we are seeing a whole bunch of backlashes to how our world is changing. I know this is not so much about the last question about what's appropriate, but people decide what is appropriate for their kids. It's just that I had a discussion with this guy, and he said, is it appropriate to talk to a kid who's 8 years old about slavery? I was like, well, I don't remember not knowing that my family was enslaved. Like, that's 8 years old. That's super late. Like, I don't even know, but it never occurred to him. I mean, this is, of course, what we talk about with privilege, but I try not to use that term. Instead, I try to say, this is how you're talking about me, this individual, this person, my life. And in fact, I had a very different experience of growing up and understanding our history than you did. And he was very upset, honestly. But you have to get through that, and we have to get through to see what do we want the coming generations to know about our world.
Thank you so much. This was absolutely incredible. There's a million more things that we could ask, and I'm sure a million more things that you can add. And we just appreciate you coming and talking to us on this important evening. I'm going to turn it over to Felicia now to close us out. Thank you again, Dr. Knox. Thank you,
Thank
everyone,
you.
for attending. Felicia,
Thank you, Dr. Knox, for your insightful presentation, and Dr. Phillips for moderating the Q&A. I'd also like to thank the family of Masha Dexter, whose endowed support has made this annual event possible. And both the Rock Library and the Sarah Doyle Center will have a display of banned and challenged books at our respective spaces starting tomorrow. Please stop by the first floor of the Rock Library and the first floor of the Sarah Doyle Center to view these displays. Thank you, Media Services and Deaf Services Unlimited, for tech and remote captioning support. I hope you all have a wonderful evening, and thank you for joining us tonight.